Teresa, with Can We Talk, Teresa Scorsa. We're actually continuing a conversation that we just finished taping because it's too good to let go. We were talking with Herb Davis and Jim Rothstein, two ex-police officers, retired police officers, with lots of great stories to tell and lots of insight into the way things work in domestic policing. And now we have Coleen Rowley and Todd Pierce with us again. Two great panelists, people who really have good opinions and lots of background and lots of information. Coleen was a former FBI special agent. Todd was with the Judge Adjutant General Corps. I always have to make sure I'm getting that part right because it's, and so they're both very knowledgeable. So let's talk about domestic policing and how, in your opinion and from your point of view, it corresponds with FBI work, with military law enforcement and so on.
Well, I found myself nodding my head in agreement with the two retired police officers a lot. Number one, I also taught law enforcement during the latter part of my career. And it corresponded with this period of time, and I think it's kind of a little bit passé now, but there was this period of about 10, 15 years where community policing was the highly touted model, okay, as opposed to this use of aggressive force. If you remember the old show Mayberry, Andy Griffith of Mayberry, he was kind of the model. He kept Mayberry in check, people safe, but he used common sense. And of course, he never let Barney have his bullet, and so this force, and so it was really kind of the thing, and people were supposed to relate on human levels. Unfortunately, and I'm again going to blame a little bit on the war paradigm, things like American Sniper, and I know Todd can talk more about this, but this militarization of the police, and it has many causes that has occurred since we kind of went into this perpetual war, is very obvious. One way that it's obvious is just the equipment. So, when the Black Lives Matter protest in Ferguson occurred, there are photos of a tank with some guy with practically a machine gun pointing it at a poor protester. And we had that here in St. Paul with the Republican National Convention. Mm-hmm. They threw tear gas, they shot rubber bullets at people, way overkill. Everyone I knew was peaceful. There were a handful of some rowdy younger kids, but even that did not rise up to this level. So back then we saw the same thing. We saw this military equipment. Well, we found out that the Army surplus has this procedure where police departments can apply for these things.
Cheap or free or?
Yes, they get them, I think, pretty much free. They have to comply. They don't have any, here's the worst part of it, there's no oversight. There's no strings attached. So once the police department gets it, in some cases there's probably very little usefulness. I know that some police departments are driving tanks around just to kind of, keep them running. And they're doing them in parades and things like that, and some of it's for show. But there's been some serious downside of this militarization. I think a lot of it is mental. I'll just mention one good aspect here. Minnesota, they've plotted the states, all 50 states, and we are one of the states that has the least amount of military equipment flowing in. So even though we have the RNC here, we're still one of the states that has the least. Number two, I don't remember his name, but it's a Republican senator in our Minnesota legislature has introduced a bill recently to provide for oversight of the military equipment by the police. And it's said that this bill is like a model for the other 49 states.
Yeah.
So it would be, again, they get this equipment and they are just kind of not given any rules or regulations about using it right now in many other states.
I was watching C-SPAN this morning, and they were discussing police procedures. This panel of really, really smart people were talking about it, and there was a judge there who said, and I agreed with her completely, if you overarm a police officer, that officer is going to eventually use every single weapon you've handed him. And if some of those are grenades or a tank, then, he'll use them, ultimately. So.
Well, I'm glad Coleen brought up Andy Griffith. Brought to mind the episode where Barney Fife bought a military surplus motorcycle along with a helmet, and it was all like World War I style stuff. And of course, it didn't take much for Barney Fife ever to go off and really abuse all whatever little authority he had.
Right.
And this was a classic case. As soon as he had the equipment, he did everything that you would have expected Barney Fife to do, and he's arresting everybody and using them, running around like he's in the military. So I think your point about if you overarm them, it's a real problem, and that has to be considered. And again, it goes to this whole over-militarization of society that we need to be aware of, because that's not a positive thing for society. I wanted to mention another source I mentioned earlier in another interview, 3 sources for good news. Another one, a 4th one, is Truthdig. And that brings to mind, I actually met Jason Leopold, who writes for Truthdig, a couple years ago, and we met in California on Hollywood Boulevard, and we're having lunch there when a large crowd came along, gathered, and the police all come along and blockaded roads off, and brought in an armored personnel carrier, all to make the arrest of one escapee, I guess. But there it was. I mean, that was right there on Hollywood Boulevard. All the over-militarization of the police force was on display, including one armored personnel carrier, and there may have been a second one there as well. And I'm not a police officer, but I cannot see why that level of force was necessary to bring about an arrest of one person when they had at least 50 officers. Of course, officer safety is always important, just as is in the military.
Right.
But again, there's such a thing as exceeding the necessary requirements for that, and the dangers, as you say, then of overarming the police. Did want to mention, I think Coleen mentioned it already, the movie American Sniper.
Yes.
And
I have not seen it, but I heard about it.
I did go see it, not because I looked through Kyle's book, and of course I was aware of the Jesse Ventura lawsuit. Just reading Kyle's book, he struck me as a very typical person I met throughout life, including in the military. I used to work in construction work, and you meet a few people in construction work who, are like to push their weight around and what we'd call bullies, I guess, or whatever. And they go into a bar, and it's a big part of it is getting in a fight or whatever. You get the same sort of people in the military, and I think we're seeing more and more. There's an article in the New York Times a week or so ago on SEAL Team 6, and how they're really doing far more than what we understand the military to be doing, including carrying out assassinations. And I think one thing we need to realize is the military, the Special Operations Command, is really operating independently of any authority. And I was actually at a class one time where I heard somebody from that command say that that's exactly the intent they had, and were trying to create the lineages for why they can exceed the authority that typically a military unit would have. I won't say more about that, but with American Sniper, I mean, the author of that, Kyle, he just struck me as this guy who really loved the war. I'm not going to do a psychoanalysis of him, but and was very boastful about it. And it used to be the stereotype of a military hero was the Audie Murphy type, who when called upon, was eager to volunteer. With World War II come along, when called upon, he basically outfought a battalion of Germans in World War II, and I was pretty humble about it. Kyle, though, he walks around, reading his book as if he's trumpeting it to the world, what an American hero he is. And so when I read of Jesse Ventura's incident with him and his lawsuit, quite honestly, I thought all the credibility was with Jesse Ventura. And I wouldn't always say that in every situation, but in that case, yeah. But it goes to the point that, how militarized we're becoming. And it's not just in seeing military equipment on the streets, but it's also in, I'm working on an article about this, I came across this a couple weeks ago, where today in baseball games, it used to be a relaxing thing for Americans to go to a baseball game, and there's mom, apple pie, and baseball. Right. And it was sort of a classic American scene that, you get away. Well, now you go there and you're buying into a propaganda barrage. We've seen the case of the NFL being paid money by the Army to have all their dedication events to the military, etc. And I used to go to a number of Washington Nationals baseball games, and there, of course, you're right in the heart of the military-industrial complex, so a big military display was always on hand. Lately, in the last couple of years, a few baseball players who've spent their growing up since 2001, it's as if they've been conditioned, psychologically conditioned, just like we saw Germans back in the late 1930s. the Germans athletes who have been standing at a strict attention at the 1936 Olympics, for example. Now we have the spectacle of American baseball players trying to out-patriotize themselves basically at a baseball game by what they've come to call national anthem standoffs.
Yeah.
One baseball player takes it upon himself to refuse to leave the field. Even if the game is ready to begin, they refuse until they're basically carted off, competing with another one. And to me, it struck me as how un-American can you get?
Yeah.
I sing the national anthem, but now instead of, as a thing that's done before the games, but it's not left at that anymore. Now you go into the seventh inning stretch. Okay, you're enjoying a good baseball game, nice evening, like at the old Metropolitan Baseball Stadium, or I don't know what they do in Minneapolis these days, but seventh inning comes along and you do the seventh inning stretch and sing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game."
Right.
Now you've got to sing "God Bless America," and it's virtually mandatory in some cities. They've even tried passing statutes making a crime to not stand up during "God Bless America."
Dear.
To me, when I read that the first time, it struck me like, okay, we got to stand up for Deutschland über alles, because it's the same thing. I looked at the lyrics even, and this idea that now it's a crime if you don't stand for God Bless America.
It's almost become a religious.
Yeah,
Right.
and the religious extremism of our own variety. And you've always got a few guys there that want to enforce it, take it upon themselves to enforce it. So that's when you know that propaganda is really working well, when you get combat multipliers, as they're called, in the military, when you get people who've been targeted basically by propaganda, when they become to reproduce it themselves and enforce it. So we're really getting, anybody that knows anything about World War II and the militarized regimes that, we fought against them, Japan and Germany in particular, and Italy, you always see the person, the athlete, or the leader or whatever, standing at strict attention. And there's a picture in the Washington Post on this baseball player, and he's standing there like the most pompous ass that you could imagine, and he even had his helmet on like a Spartan helmet, and the smug look like I'm more patriotic than anybody else in the stadium. And that to me, having read of Japan, and my dad was the victim of that militarism, that we're following those footsteps almost exactly.
Yeah. Step by step.
And if we did a cultural anthropologist came in and studied our society today, like we hired them to study Japan back in the 30s and Germany in the 30s and 40s, I think they'd come to pretty much the same conclusion. This is a nation being driven by militarism that sees no limit to its ability to wage war on other nations, neither legal nor moral.
Right.
And that puts us in pretty bad company.
Yeah, it certainly does.
And I'm just going to talk a little bit more about this popular culture.
Yeah.
But the popular culture is actually, to a large extent, the direct result of what the Pentagon used to call its propaganda department. It used to be called that, outright. I don't know what the new term is, information something or other, they made it, tried to make it. But it has a lot of people. I mean, I saw the thousands of people assigned to this, and of course in every agency there is a PR person that works on these issues to make sure that people continue to toe the line. Not the least of which is Hollywood. We've talked about Charlie Wilson's War and Zero Dark 30 as being very much disinformation. There's another one as American Sniper. And not only is it disinformation, but it's very well done. I have to give, I guess, credit to Clint Eastwood to some extent, because when he opens up, and I didn't see the movie, but I've read enough reviews of it, it opens up with him shooting a little boy and a mother. And in the movie, they make the facts, of course, they're concocting these facts to make it look like this is justified. One review I read said they take out all context. So whenever he's killing 100 and some Iraqis, you never see their families. You never see that any of this is wrong. It all turns out that he's correct. Well, then you get audiences leaving. And this is where actually the police now, if you have to understand police, they're in an environment with a large number, a majority of people that think violence works.
Yeah.
They have seen this movie. They think that the American Sniper is a hero. Well, I'll get a gun, and I'll be a hero like the American Sniper.
Right.
Not only the movie, but then, of course, the video games, the violent video games,
Call of Duty. And
That's right. I mean, my son brought home one of these things when he was 12. We didn't even really spend his Christmas money, and all of a sudden, you're looking at a screen, and when you hit somebody on the screen, blood splatters, and the more realistic, the better. And he's talking to all these other little boys about how many people we can kill.
Yeah.
So those little boys grow up. And unfortunately, then the police are in the situation of dealing with that mindset. So, of course, they've been taught better to be judged by 12 than carried by 6. That is common. I heard the same thing in the FBI a few times. And so this mindset is going to always make you want to be careful for yourself and your colleagues.
Right.
And again, it is very dangerous. We have one of we consider ourselves an exceptional nation, but our crime rate puts us as one of the worst.
Our prison,
Our
our
prison-
incarceration rate is horrible.
Looking strictly at this incident as a military operation, I think you could argue that one of the best, most competently conducted operations in a military style was the Newtown shooting. You look at the guy who did that shooting, and he had some mental problems to start with, but entirely aggravated by his fixation on military games, video games, his mother's own problems. So she goes out and thinks to help him, buy a AR-15, an M16 style gun. So he's got the military gun that all the video games are about. And obviously one day his mind snapped and he goes in, and first he takes out some surveillance, his mother, kills her, goes to school, and again infiltrates and kills a whole bunch of kids.
Yeah.
I don't know what was going on with his mind, but it was a perfect example of perhaps the outcome of all this militarized conditioning that virtually the entire United States, the younger generations go through today.
Yes.
Just reading the other day on the recent increase in crime after years of going down. But you think of it now, the kids 14 years old today have spent their entire lives immersed in a world that we celebrate warrior values. I mean, it's getting in
Yes.
many cities, and DC in particular, they compete with who can name the most streets Warrior Way or Warrior this, Warrior that.
Yeah.
We don't talk about celebrating the sacrifices, maybe, and saying thanks as we did earlier on to service members. But now, like last year in DC, we had the Concert for Valor, which to me changes the tone of this. It's one thing to say thank you for your sacrifice to the guys who lost their legs or were sacrificed in other ways. It's another way to elevate the warrior up to a higher stage than anybody else. To say we have to pay homage now to the warrior, the valor, with valor. It's really becoming, it's the sort of thing that, again, they do it in the most militarized states.
Mhm.
Germany in the 30s, 40s, Japan, ancient Sparta. And this is what we stood against for 200 and some years. We were founded on exactly the opposite of those
On the
principles.
opposite, isolationism.
Right. Well, not even isolationism, but just the idea that we are a peaceful nation. And that's going to be our strength and not our weakness. Now we've inverted that to we're a warrior nation, and that's going to be our strength, not our weakness. But in fact, the error of that is you look at these militarized states, and they've got a very short lifespan. How long did Nazi Germany last? How long did Japan last once they went from a democracy in the late 20s into the militarized state they became?
Good point.
They have a very short lifespan, and that's what we've chosen as our course now. We want to celebrate the World War II enemy that we had for their martial values. We're doing the same thing. And one final thing. But this thing all provokes reaction, blowback, as the CIA calls it. And so SEAL Team 6, they're killing a lot of civilians. We're killing a lot of civilians two ways, like as if it's a second coming of the Phoenix program. One with the drones and one with SEAL Team 6. And no doubt they've got a lot of valor, they go in the area of danger, but frequently they go into a house, they invade it, and kill a number of civilians, and make, 5 times more enemies than the number of people they kill.
Right.
It's fighting the war of attrition that Westmoreland fought in Vietnam and lost over again.
Yeah.
And unless we find a different strategy, a different means of life, meaning we go back to a peaceful way of life, there's ways to reconcile these issues. Now, believe me, diplomatically and others, cut off the people who are most dangerous. But we're not even searching for that. We're just talking about sending SEAL Team 6 in to kill a bunch more, and then we wonder why we're not a perfect. Coleen and I don't wonder why, but it almost makes you think that it really is our strategy of the military-industrial complex to put us on a course of perpetual war.
Yes.
You know, I wanted to follow up with this American Sniper looking like the hero in the video games. Those violent video games were actually used in recruiting centers. And so this is helping, I mean, they see it as, okay, we're getting these young children to be excited about shooting and whatever, and then they'll join, and then they see the movies and they say, I want to be a hero. This is an identity, especially for kids who have grown up maybe without the strongest families, maybe just looking for going to college, but this gives them this bonding and this identity, and then they see this hero who is, killing people abroad for freedom. There's another aspect, which is, I'll get into trouble for this, but there's a far-right Christian where if you can actually find this, it's incredible. My Jesus is stronger than your God and all this type of thing.
Gosh.
We actually have an acquaintance that we know who heads up the Military Religious Freedom Foundation. His name's Mikey Weinstein. And he has found all of this infusion, and of course it goes back to the old song, God is on my side.
Yeah.
Even the Roman emperors realized if they put a cross on the shield, people would think they're fighting for their God. And obviously the Islamic extremists have the exact same belief.
Right.
But this is really, really dangerous, because now, on top of being a hero, you're thinking that somehow this is a religious salvation too.
Right.
That you're fighting for your, and it's pretty powerful. A lot of moderate religious beliefs have actually kind of, they're not very powerful, or they've either been curtailed, whereas the religious extremes on both levels have then been buoyed up.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to, let me see what I was going to say. I mean, say something else about the dangers of this militarization. I've lost my train of thought. I'm talking too much. But I'll remember later.
Let me jump in real quick with a comment. It was Lieutenant General Jerry Boynton, who was the head of Special Operations Command, who said, my God is more powerful, than your God, or said that along with others who said it. But I was at a political meeting a couple of years ago when I first came back to Minnesota, and I went to this thing, and this youngish lady, obviously had telling by her comments, she had a couple kids, and she sort of it's clear she got into politics just in, fairly recently. So, and back in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of talk about how the movies are corrupting our youth by conservatives, and in some ways, I think they're absolutely right. I mean, again, movies and all this stuff does have a social conditioning effect, whether it's violent movies or, so it's ignorant to sit there and say it's just a movie or it's just fun or something like that. So yeah, that's how societies like Germany, Nazi Germany, made their people complicit in what were going on. So this youngish woman gets up and says, you got to get away from watching TV, get your kids away from that. Don't let them be influenced by TV. Do things with them. Take them out to a movie. Go out and see Zero Dark 30. And at that point, my head was going to explode, I thought, take them out and watch how the CIA tortures non-Americans.
Yeah.
And, get them ready so that they can take their place someday when they're older, is basically what she was saying.
Yeah.
So, I mean, to me, I think Coleen can talk more about psychopathology, but we're enculturating psychopathology, I would say.
Okay.
And the polls show that well over a majority of Americans now believe that torture works. This movie and Jack Bauer 24 were enormously powerful. So for anybody to say that movies don't matter, Hollywood, by the way, when the shooting in Newtown occurred, there were some people that said, that kid was addicted to violent video games. It turns out some of the other killers are too. The one in Santa Barbara, the one in the Navy Yard shooter. And so why can't somebody really do something? I'm all for freedom of speech, but if you can see a correlation now, a pretty strong correlation between young men addicted to violent video games, they are, most of them do suffer from some form of mental illness. I read the entire, what he called his manifesto or whatever, the Santa Barbara killer. And he was mentally ill. He lacked interpersonal skills, and he could not get dates with sorority girls, etc. But then, so you read this long thing, and he's chronicling over years his difficulty in interacting with women when he's in college, he falls on the answer that if I just get a gun and shoot people, that will solve my problems.
Yeah.
Now that last part of it is only from what we're culturing people to believe.
Right.
This will solve my problems. I can't get a date, so I'm going to go shoot some people. And you see this over and over and over. The answer to my personal problems, whatever, is to shoot some people.
Right.
And it comes from seeing this in the movies. This is what they do in the movies.
And I agree with you, but I think that I'm very opposed to any sort of censorship because, you know, it's always going to be misused.
Yeah.
But I think the violent video games are more the trigger or they're part of it, but it's a constant state of war. I mean, you don't need to go to a violent video game to be, you know, enculturated by this constant psychology of war that we have today. 14 years now we've been going on, and you know, whatever you want to look at the internet or whatever, it's all the neoconservatives. I don't know if anybody's mentioned them so far in this. I want to be sure to point my finger at neoconservatives and as well their neoliberal counterparts in the other party, all finding war to be desirable, whether it's to spread democracy like the neocons or to the responsibility to protect like the neoliberals, interventionists, as if spreading depleted uranium around the country is actually protecting the people.
Right.
So again, it's just this culture of war culture we've created for ourselves now. So whether it's, you know, video games are part of it, but I think if we weren't in this constant state of war, the video games really wouldn't have as much anywhere near the meaning.
Right.
One final thing, going back to show 24, that really did a tremendous amount of harm. A Brigadier General Finnegan, who was teaching, who was a dean of students at West Point back in the early, 2005, 2006, he knew this. He knew the harm it was doing, and it was legitimizing torture. He went out to Hollywood actually and spoke to the producers, and they just blew him off. I mean, remember, the 24 producers were these neocon types, and they just blew Finnegan off. Finnegan was a tremendous person. I met him, and he organized, and the military officers, you could say, at West Point, was my impression, they were sort of rebelling against the Dick Cheney neocons. They organized a conference back in 2007, counterterrorism in the law or something, and it was entirely a repudiation of the Cheneyite neocons and Show 24, and Brigadier General Finnegan had largely organized it. So, but the military is going to get most of the blame. I'm not defending them because they deserve most of the blame. But there's some outstanding people in the military who stood against torture, stood against these neocons, and I think the blame really needs to be placed on these people such as producers of 24, their neocon allies, and it's time to take our country back from these militarists who are dragging it into the abyss.
They sold us a lie that violent war would somehow solve the problem and prevent any terrorist attack. In a similar way, crime, dealing with crime, we can never end crime. No matter how great a community policing program you have, no matter how great an investigator, the best you can do is reduce it. That's just the human condition.
Right.
And I happened to be in Norway talking to some people just last week. And I said, Norway kind of has a model prison system compared to the United States. In the United States, the prisons are exploding with people. And he says, we don't call it a prison system. We used to have an icon for our prison system that had bars. And he says, we threw that out. We have this new icon. I don't know what the image is. But he said, we have a new image, and it's called Crime Cure. Think about that, Crime Cure. And I thought, wow. And we could do that also with our military who thinks of themselves as policing the world. It's the same, this is the kind of the justification, we're the policemen of the world. We have to go in and right to protect. When the Sunnis and the Shiites are battling each other, we will be the policemen of the world, and we're doing good things. That's the same thing as domestic policing, and I think the crime cure is the way to look at it. You want to reduce it. You don't want to grow the problem and make it worse just to keep your job going and to keep your salary going.
Right.
You want to work on it, and the way you work on it is through more of a community approach. You definitely don't use this force and incarceration, solitary confinement, because that's actually hurting. That's actually increasing the problem.
Right. Oh my gosh. I was just thinking of something that's now trying to escape, so I've got to pull it back. here it is, when you glorify warriors, which is what we've been doing lately, you glorify war. Because nobody ever went up and thanked a stranger for doing something bad. So it's implicit that if you're thanking someone for all you've done for us in our country, you're implying that it has been something glorious and wonderful and heroic. And of course, that's not always the case. And in a lot of cases, you're thanking a warrior for doing something that he actually has not yet done, and maybe never will, because not every uniformed soldier has been in the heat of battle, recently at least. So,
Going along with the comment earlier about
Yes.
our religion, war has become our religion, I would say. And we have the warriors, so-called warriors, now I'm saying it, service members, they're the holy cows, you could say. When I was in DC 2008 through 2012, I'd have my uniform on frequently as needed, walking the streets of DC. It's like people wanted to come up and, everyone had to say thank you for your service. A lot of them wanted to touch you, again, like you're a holy cow.
yeah.
When the Tea Party first came up there in, 2009 or whatever, I mean, they were the worst. They'd come up and say, thank you for your service, can I shake your hand, blah, blah, blah. And I throw in, if you really want to cut wasteful government spending, start where it's worst. Cut the Department of Defense. And, it wasn't what they expected to hear from somebody in uniform. But I consider myself an American patriot. But let's start identifying the problem for what it is. It's not being an American and wanting to live peacefully in the world. It's about being a militarist and wanting to wage war to maintain a military-industrial complex that's gotten beyond control, and a secret intelligence service that's basically acting as a double government now. And all of that is as un-American as you can possibly get.
And on that note, we've come to the end of our time and probably passed it again because that's what we do. I want to thank our guests. I want to thank Coleen Rowley, Todd Pierce, their experience. If you added it all together, it would be 100 years of knowledge and experience and wisdom. So thanks very much. I'm Teresa Scorset for Can We Talk, and we hope to see you soon.